Wow, coerced singing. This is what I get for coming to an event where beer is served while I'm speaking. But it's very nice to be here. Happy Easter, everyone. Christ is risen. Hallelujah. All right. And just to check, because my husband would want me to, Christos anesti. Yeah. Hallelujah. All right. I did that to my stat students because I teach at a Christian college, and they did not nail the Greek, but someone did know the Latin, which was fun. And then someone stumped me with the Polish, which was fair. I'm really glad to be here with you guys tonight to talk about how to build up Christian community and how each of us can kind of cultivate a charism of hospitality, or if that sounds too intimidating, just the practice of spending time with other people. Because one of the things that really was fascinating to me about Catholicism before I ever thought it might be true, but something that seemed to indicate it was truer than other strains of Christianity, was the tremendous diversity of vocations recognized within the church. I had heard or I had believed that Christianity meant a kind of flattening out of personality, that giving up what was wrong in your life meant becoming less and less an individual. And in some faiths or some denominations, it certainly can seem like that's true. But in Catholicism, there's always been a lot of room for a lot of different kinds of saints. There are saints who are consecrated monastics who have given up marriage to give their lives utterly to Christ, which has been a scandal through much of human history. And there are saints like the Martins, who just had a beautiful family, which turned out to itself be full of at least one saint, but who lived a life of simple family piety that we might not know of had Therese of Lisieux not written a book. There are saints who, at the risk of their own life, would not be complicit in any form of violence. And there are saints like Joan of Arc who led armies in pursuit of a just cause. And G.K. Chesterton, as is often the case, has strong words on this subject, where he says, the thing about the church is it is passionately in favor of chastity, and passionately in favor of chastity in all cases. I'm misquoting Chesterton. Passionately in favor of celibacy, and passionately in favor of marriage. And he goes, the church has these virtues like red and white, like the red and white cross on the shield of St. George, but it has always had a healthy hatred of pink. And so there's this tremendous variety and vivacity of ways people have chosen to live their lives for God with his encouragement. And then there are some that are kind of so strange that they're not even as much mentioned or as much cited today, because I got kind of interested in the stories of the Stylites, who are folks who wanted to give their life in peaceful contemplation of God, and did that by living on platforms raised up above the street or in remote places, just to be silently and patiently and obediently with God. And because they were doing this, often there would be kind of a flood of pilgrims who would come to their quiet retreats, because they go, wow, you have given your whole life as a stylite on this platform for God. Tell us what you've learned. But this isn't really a vocation people actively discern most of the time. I have friends who have discerned whether they might be called to the priesthood. I have some friends for whom, they're still in formation, some friends for whom they've considered it and ultimately not become priests. I'm blessed to have friends who have become consecrated religious, some in the Dominican order. And I have friends who have considered it, and gone elsewhere. I have friends who have discerned a vocation to marriage and been married, but I have no friends who have told me that they've really been talking to their spiritual director about their calling to be a stylite. Which makes it weird that there are so many people living that life accidentally. Now, although the Stylites were called, to this life very specifically, and often, had to spend time in prayer and discernment before retreating from human company to spend their life nakedly with God, many people, especially in times of transition in their life, find themselves in a new town, in a new city, isolated from other people they know, living in isolation, living in my own city of New York quite high up, in the rest of the country perhaps not quite so high, but in solitary cells, alone nakedly with God, without the support of other people being part of their prayer life or being included in their love for God. And throughout kind of monastic history, this is crazy. People who wanted to be hermits at the time of the Desert Fathers needed the permission of their monastic superior, because taking on such a serious spiritual work as living alone with God meant you really should be prepared first by living in community and being close to a confessor who could watch over you. So this was viewed as, even for people who had spent years in formation as brother monks, wild to take on without preparation and the approval of someone else. But common now to take on, the moment you graduate from college or the moment you change jobs and find yourself alone. So when I became Catholic, I was lucky because I wasn't left in this predicament, because when you convert, it's a little bit like firing off a flare gun. And I had a lot of people who all wanted to talk to me at once for my reasons, to tell me who I should pick as my confirmation saint. It was Augustine. I even had a very friendly priest both choose my parish for me and then choose me a friend at the parish. And he made an excellent pick. But most people don't have that when they're Catholic and alone and kind of feeling uprooted from whatever their community has been till this point, or a community that's kind of fallen away under them. And so a lot of what I became interested in was about how we can create thicker Christian community, how we can expand how we love God with each other. Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, is kind of about making the case for that need for community. And kind of the best description of what he's talking about came from Ross Douthat, who said, ultimately, the Benedict option is just a ratchet effect. It's moving one step further into love of God and into sharing that love with others than you were by default. And so what that one step forward, what that ratchet looks like, varies a lot based on where you're starting right now. And for someone kind of with a strong community around you already, who often invites people in or depends on others, you might feel like you're prepared to take on something wilder. For someone who feels alone or isolated, simply suggesting to a friend that they meet at your home instead of a coffee shop may be a more significant step. But my focus in the book, my own book, is really just on how to find what that next ratchet step is, and how to find it kind of over this time scale of the next 2 weeks to 2 months. The immediate time scale where you can notice if you haven't done it. I have very philosophically minded friends, and sometimes when we had these conversations, the discussion about how to build community would drift quickly into, when we have children and have set up a communal preschool, which method of instruction will be best for the children, and how will we decide who teaches chemistry when several people have already said they want to? And these are enjoyable discussions, but not very practical in terms of immediate action or spurring us to notice if we're really caring for each other and the people around us. So some of the things that have been really fruitful for me as questions to prompt me to take that next step, and I'll name 2 of them right now. One is, what do I do alone that I could do with other people? What do I do in private that I could do publicly? So starting with that first question, one of the things I wanted was just to share things that were good with more people. One of the reasons our culture is both so fascinated by marriage and so terrible at talking about marriage is we've narrowed what friendship looks like so starkly that many people reasonably think the only time they'll really get to enjoy having someone else in their life is when they are married. And even while making a conscious effort to cultivate friendships, I've certainly found that some of the benefits of marriage in my life are just the benefits of friendship shared more readily. It's the pleasure of singing in the shower and having my husband join in on the chorus, right? Because prior to that, when I didn't have a husband, and if I didn't have housemates who were all waiting in line for the same bathroom with me, one of the things that I lacked in my life was just the ability to sing with other people. It's a normal thing to want, but something that only happened for me at Mass, and at a time when I am not the one picking which hymns I get to sing, and even when it is my favorite hymn, I do not get to pick the tempo. Some songs are not meant to be sung at a dirge pace. And I love what one sociologist, Ray Oldenburg, who kind of writes about how we create communities, says about this, which he says it's normal to sing with people when you're having a good time, or it was normal. He says that this is something that's approved of sometimes, like people can have music a bit It's not entirely disallowed. And he was writing at an earlier time, so he goes, a young man can have a Walkman or a boombox, and that's acceptable. But he says, let him sing. Let him make music of his own. And people cross the street to avoid him. He says, people are expected who once gathered in parks with beer kegs to content themselves with a little singing in the shower. And I certainly didn't want to content myself with only that. So one of the things I did alone that I wanted to do with other people desperately was just to sing. And I was very lucky in that, I talked about this desire with other friends who shared it, and one of my friends who had a piano invited us all over and asked us to send her a list of our favorite hymns, and she would learn them. And we gathered together, and it was a small group. We couldn't have, sustained a heavy multi-part arrangement of anything. But for the first time for most of us in years, we sung a song we loved that expressed our love for God with other people. And in some cases, even if we'd gotten very lucky on the music rota, we sang it for the first time with a friend whom we love, who we pray for, who we had never gotten to pray together with in this way. So we took something good and beautiful that we usually only enjoyed alone and found a way to share it together. And I think that's the most intuitive place to start with something you know is good and know is nourishing. And just the world we live in does not consider it normal or natural or common to share it and to invite someone else in. But I've also had surprisingly good luck asking people to do together what we do alone for things that are in fact terrible and unfun and unpleasant. One of the things I hate doing most is applying for jobs. And I think everyone does, but I have a case for why I hate it even more than other people in this room. It's because I've worked in writing for a while. And that meant I had periods of time where I applied for jobs that were not paid. And I write whole applications of please consider me for this internship. I send it out into the void, which is kind of frustrating enough. And then I hear nothing back, which after a period of time means no. And usually, at least when you apply for jobs, people have elected not to pay you the salary of this position to do this work. But when I apply for jobs that are not paid, it actually means that they've said, Leah, we considered whether we wanted to have a phone interview with you to think about whether your work was worth literally nothing to us, but the opportunity cost of employing you. And we decided not to bother. So I found this profoundly depressing. And it's kind of in those moments, the moments even of writing it, anticipating this response, the waiting, everything else, that the voice in the back of your head that says that is true. You are kind of worthless in some ways, feels a lot louder or more persuasive. And for me, it was kind of only so persuasive sometimes on the job front. Eventually I pushed through. But especially as a convert, sometimes what that voice was saying to me is you're really too bad at prayer to pray. You should get better at prayer first before you try this again. And it's the kind of thing that certainly sounds dumb out loud, right? And it didn't just sound dumb when I heard friends of mine have similar experiences. It made me furious. Because if someone had said that to my friends who were applying for jobs or other friends of mine who were converts, I would have punched them. Which possibly wouldn't have been the best response, but it would have been my first chivalrous response. And luckily, since this is not a voice that comes from God, punching is always on the table, though it takes the form of praying the St. Michael's prayer for my friend. But it cheers me up a lot to remember that it's an option, an encouraged option. But I wanted to do more together with friends than kind of just commiserate sometimes about how frustrating this was alone, pray for each other separately, and then just hope for the best. So I invited my friends over to work on job applications at my house. And I said, come on over, we'll pray evening prayer, we'll work on job applications, we'll have dinner, we'll work on job applications, I will make a skillet cookie, which is what it sounds like. It's an entire cookie the size of a skillet. We will eat it. Possibly not the whole thing, but it really depends on how many people come. And then we'll pray night office. And I wanted to kind of arrange it this way, first of all, so that I wasn't gathering people like with the hymn event to share something that was good. So I wanted to kind of fold it all into prayer, into the liturgy of the hours. So it was contained in prayer, and we'd ask God to be with us the whole time. Sometimes even just the thing I love best about the liturgy of the hours, it does feel like everything that happens between the hours is almost an interruption from prayer, that prayer could be happening the whole time. And I most notice that prayer is available to me at those specific times. But it makes prayer feel more real and everything else feel more subordinated to it. So I wanted that really to happen, especially for something that kind of brought up such destructive emotions for all of us. But even when we weren't praying, when we were in the middle of the lousy part, I thought that just being together, having had dinner together, being at the same table, even though, on kind of anonymizing laptops, meant that when you looked up and felt lousy, you would see that there were other people there who all liked you and were there bodily with you during this. And that our simple act of presence could be a rebuke to that satanic voice that kind of speaks up whenever we're in moments of weakness. So sometimes sharing things that are already good is a way to bring you even closer together, but finding a way to be with people in the middle of things that don't rise to the level of dramatic suffering, the kind of suffering you're like, now is the time for a grief casserole, right? It's not that bad, it's not enough to complain about, but there's a moment where you can, instead of being alone, be together and hold each other up in prayer. So I'd like you to, especially since many of you guys are at tables, and for folks who are at the chairs, just to briefly introduce yourself. I'm just going to pause now and a couple other times during the talk to give you a moment to talk about whether there's anything in your life now that you do alone that you'd like to try doing with other people. Whether it's a good thing you can share and invite people into, or a hard thing you'd like other people's presence for. So I'm going to give you guys about 4 minutes to talk at your tables. All right, I'm going to interrupt you, but I know there's socializing afterwards, so you can continue these conversations afterwards. I would be curious if anyone either has an example they'd like to share or heard an example at their table that they'd like to share, whether the original speaker is saying it or not. Did anyone have something they liked or that they heard that they thought was interesting? Folding laundry and doing the gardening. That's great. I actually really like getting to give this talk because I hear examples that I haven't heard before, but I've heard doing meal prep as a thing that people wanted to do together, which I think especially makes sense during the point where a lot of my friends who are younger parents don't see many other grown-ups during the day necessarily. And that one more task can actually be a moment you come together rather than something you have to do amid everything else that's going on. Thank you. All right. Does anyone have one more example they'd like to share?
I have one.
Yeah.
There's a woman in our parish who has a great love of the tradition of formed cookies, pressing. And she brought it over to the school I saw recently too, and shared it with kids. And she does it with anybody who wants to at the festive times of the year. And she makes it an educational thing, but it's very casual, but it's beautiful.
That's so great. I'm so glad to hear that. It was just for the other end of the room, it was someone who loves doing pressed out formed cookies and not only makes them for other people, but whenever people express interest, it sounds like is always willing to have them over to make them with her. I was really lucky this Easter season because a friend of mine who's Slovenian asked us over if we wanted to make pasanski, which I may be pronouncing incorrectly, but like wax resist multiple dyes eggs. And it was so wonderful, not only just doing, but being invited into her home and into her joy. And I knew something about my friend I didn't know until the end of doing that. The other kind of frame I like to think about just to come up with ideas that make sense where I am in my life and make sense for you in whatever community you're already part of is, what do I do in private that I could do in public? And there's two main reasons I think about this. One is that I need to remember myself, that I'm not so limited in where I can pray as I think. And it's really the second reason is to be able to invite others in. Because again, especially for me as a convert, initially I was an atheist, so where do I pray was nowhere. And so when I became Catholic, I believed in God, but I didn't know him initially. I just had a philosophical conversion. That's what that first book is about. And then the process of learning afterwards, becoming Catholic is not like, now I have an argument for why God exists. It's like, now I know God, so I have to get to know God and be aware that he's known me this whole time and I've been ignoring him. So for me, it was really a challenge to make space for God in my life, which is ridiculous since he made my whole life. But I kind of knew initially that places you could pray definitely were church and before bed. And everything else kind of had to be an addition for me and a conscious choice. So one thing I tried to do a bit more was just to break my own habits of not prayer by being willing to pray anywhere. And this is not how I started as a new Catholic. I would have the impulse to pray for someone and go, I should remember that for when I am praying later. And it really took time for me to go from that to, okay, maybe sometimes I'll pray the rosary on my commute, like with my fingers, so that it's not a visible rosary, which might be too much, right? And I want you to remember that I live in New York City, where people do breakdancing on the subway. And no one gets off the subway thinking, I saw a young lady praying the rosary and it was quite strange. And then two men with a guitar, drums, and a accordion got on, which happened to me yesterday. So it was just my own hesitation about prayer and my own kind of still learning that the whole world is God's and he's not waiting at church for me or waiting for my moments only of peace, but he's ready to hear my prayer, eager to hear it at any time. So praying in public became for me mostly a way of just reminding myself of that. It wasn't intended as a public witness. It was just a reminder. Sometimes it functions as a public witness, even when that's not what I'm intending or even a time I particularly want to be interrupted. But I've had moments where because I'm praying not secretly with my fingers, but in a way that's visible and recognizable, that people talk to me. So at one point I was on the train in Connecticut and I was praying the Divine Mercy Chaplet. And a man across the aisle goes like, is that a rosary? Are you praying the rosary? And I'm like, well, sort of, yes, a bit, Divine Mercy Chaplet, yes. And he was just a very friendly guy who was Catholic, as it turns out, and saw me praying and so wanted to ask about it. And then because we started chatting on the train, he said, well, while you're praying, please pray for me because my leukemia had gone into remission, but I've gotten kind of more and more worrying blood results recently, and I don't know what I'm going to hear next. And I promised I would, and I did. And I asked him to pray for my dad, who was getting ready for heart surgery that fall. My dad's doing very well now, but I've been on trains repeatedly, presumably, with people who wanted to be prayed for and were willing to pray for me. And it's only rarely that connection actually happens. It happens sometimes when people can catch me being Catholic. It happens a little bit on Ash Wednesday, when everyone becomes as visible as the sisters are now. And I know, as someone who has stopped habited religious, to ask them to pray for me when I'm having kind of something really difficult happen, that there's an invitation in public prayer. And sometimes it's an invitation for whatever feelings people have about the church, which aren't always positive. But it is kind of a bat signal to anyone who wants prayer that this person who is praying might be willing to pray for you. And so I've never had it happen to me at a time where I was like, this will be a really interesting witness. It's just that I'm going about my day and people can see it. And then if they want to, they approach me. Now, the other reason I do try and take some of my prayer out of just the privacy of my home, first for me, but then sometimes actually as a deliberate, active invitation, is just because I think of it as a way to not ask the Holy Spirit to have to work so hard in my life. That there are things I do with folks that I know there are other people who are interested in or need it or are curious, and I'm often asking the Holy Spirit to work very hard to make our paths cross when, for example, we have our reading of Twelfth Night by Shakespeare on Twelfth Night with our chalking of the doors as our kind of liturgical play event. And I invite all my friends. But if there's someone else who would really be on fire to go, I would like to take part in liturgy today and also read Shakespeare, It's hard for them to happen to find their way to my apartment building. I don't have a stoop where anyone can spot me doing it. So I'm kind of asking the Holy Spirit, like, well, bring anyone here who should be here, but I guess they have to walk into my building by accident, get off on a random floor, walk down the hallway, trip, hit their head on my door so I open it, and then go like, are you all right? By the way, did you know we're reading 12th night in here? And it's not that this is beyond God, but it's like a little much for me to assume God will act this dramatically in my life as often as people could enter it. And instead, sometimes what's happened is just we go about our lives just in a more public place, and again, the space creates the invitation. So when I lived in DC, I had, in kind of an unusual circumstance, an argument on Facebook that turned into a monthly debating group, which was a much better ending to an argument on Facebook than most of them that I have had. And we usually debated in my apartment, but when it was very nice out, we debated on the roof of the building. And it was a very large building and a very large roof, so I was reasonably confident we wouldn't irritate people. But we were up there again, and this woman comes up to me and goes, "Are you the group that debates on the roof here?" And I'm like, yes, really sure the next thing out of her mouth will be, "Please don't do that. This is a place for barbecues and nothing else." But instead she said, "My son and I saw you guys up here a different time, and he's 13, and he was wondering if it would be all right if he sat nearby while you guys are debating so he could listen to the debate because it was interesting." And I said, "He can't do that. He can't sit nearby in a little sad annex. He can come sit with us. He can sit with us, and if he has questions when it's question time, he can ask them. If he wants to give a speech, he can give a speech." And privately, I didn't quite let this come out of my mouth, right? But if your son is weird enough, he wants to do this, he is certainly welcome to. And it turns out he lived in our building. He was homeschooled and lived in our building, but we had no idea this was going on a couple floors away from him once a month until they saw us. And then I got his mom's email, and we invited him every month, and everyone enjoyed having him there. We enjoyed it partly because we were a group of 20-somethings working in DC who saw no teenagers ever. We were certainly too young to have any of our own. We weren't friends with people who were old enough to be parents of kids that age. So suddenly there was a whole range of human life that had re-entered ours. And I was very happy because not everyone in the debating circle was Christian. And when the 13-year-old attended, the swearing went way down. I was very grateful for. And again, we didn't have a plan in doing that. We just did what we were doing together in a place where people could stumble on it. And this doesn't happen to me every time I do this. We had a picnic, what we called our Litany of the Saints picnic, where we just had people come to our picnic in a park, and they could bring stories about any saint they wanted to tell us about. Which is really fun for me because I just didn't know most of my friends' confirmation saints. And even when I knew of the saint, I didn't always know what about this saint my friend loved. And we did it in a park rather than in my house because we figured it's possible someone will see this and go, "This looks interesting," and kind of wander over. To my knowledge, no one did. It's possible that someone overheard the story of Christina, not the astonishing Christina, a saint who is not astonishing but is nevertheless a saint, which one of my friends told because her confirmation saint was Christina, the not notably astonishing, and she always had to clarify this. But I don't know. But we left kind of more room for anything to happen and kind of be grown by the Holy Spirit, even beyond what was achieved in our eyes, just by having it be visible to others. So again, I just want to pause for a couple minutes to ask if there's anything you already do or are planning to do that you might do outside your home and then might find a way of sharing with other people. All right, I'm going to interrupt you again. Does anyone have an example they'd like to share about a way of taking a private practice, whether it's individual or in a group, and making it public? Yes.
out loud audibly, said the rosary together. And it was a very powerful prayer time for us.
I love that. I'm going to repeat it just a little bit for the room, which is that you and your friends were on a beach and someone suggested since they all had rosaries, they should just pray them. And they did out loud on a beach. And I love that particularly because I am tremendously fond of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, who I see other people are also, Dominicans are also fond of, but who would do this with his friends, would take them on hikes and go, and let's pray the rosary on this hike. And you never know whether it's a reminder to someone else who's passing or just even a reminder just to you guys that this is God's place here. And I think that's wonderful.
So this is also an advertisement for any young families who are here. But next month, the young families and couples group here at the parish will be doing a hike at a nearby nature center together. Like one, I don't know, short for little legs. And then ending with a campfire and evening prayer together.
Excellent. Actually, Liz, would you just stand up so people can see who they should find just to make sure they know that? The Young Families Group will have a hike, a campfire, and evening prayer, and the hike will be sized so that your children and or you, if you are not feeling up to a hike, will be able to complete it. That sounds wonderful. One last one in back.
Making art together.
What kind of art were you making or thinking of making?
Anything.
Yeah.
Just being creative together.
That's excellent. And that's, this actually touches on one of the other questions I want to give you guys to consider. So I'm going to name a couple other prompts of ways to think about how to invite people into prayer and hospitality together. But one is, where can we focus on space for beauty together? Whether it's making art, whether it's the stamped cookies or the pisanski. After we did the eggs, my husband said, it's so unusual for us to get together with people and just have the whole purpose of our gathering be beauty. I think often if we get together casually with people and have no particular goal in mind, if we're not careful, someone who observed the gathering might think, in my circles, that the goal of our gathering was to recap recent Twitter developments, right? And it's so different instead to have the explicit goal of our gathering be beauty. One of the things my family did is that we have had people kind of, for Marian feasts, bring their favorite Marian hymns or poems to our house, and then we make dinner, and everyone shares them, or sings them, as it were. But we also had one event that was just after a particularly kind of politically contentious moment, where we invited folks over that wasn't a specifically religious event, but the event was a poetry memorization party. So people had to show up with their memorized poems. And our goal was having a way for our politically diverse group of friends to be together around something that wasn't what they were angry about. But also that having memorized poems meant that they'd taken something beautiful and made it part of them they were going to be able to keep carrying after that night. And people really, all different lengths of poems, like short poems, haiku almost length. And then one person showed up with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which was very impressive. And it was quite long. He read it, he spoke it beautifully, and presumably he still has it now, which is amazing. But, the scope of this can be varied. I did not memorize a poem that long. I memorized a sonnet. But our goal was just to make beauty our reason for gathering and not be embarrassed about having that be our reason for gathering, that we should be doing something useful or productive or blandly social, right? So one of the questions I want you guys just to consider after this talk with your friends, with your family is, what of the gatherings we have now are about beauty? And how could we have that be more the center of the reason we're with people we love? Now, I know you guys do some of that already because I was told you had a procession down Michigan Avenue, a Eucharistic procession, which is certainly a gathering that is beautiful and is for the author of beauty. So it can be around forms of secular beauty or sacred ones, but really making that the reason we see our friends and something we share with them. I also want to suggest as another question to consider is just growing up, what habits of prayer did you have in your own family if your family was religious? And are any of those habits able to be adapted for where you are now? Whether it's a prayer you want to revive in your own family, whether you're someone living with housemates or with classmates who has a prayer practice you want to make a house prayer practice. And the last question that I found helpful is just kind of looking for examples of hospitality I see in others, including ones that I just definitely actually don't want to take on myself. But noting them and speaking about them more, because sometimes what I find is that the kind of hospitality that I know I don't want to take on, that would be crazy for me to take on, when I talk about it, someone else goes, that could fit into my life, and I want to do it. So I really don't want to leave you guys with a sense of there's a specific list of ways to pray with others or ways to invite people over that's the one universal list, but that God has already put everything into your life you need to welcome others. And that sometimes it's the examples of other people that, even something someone does once, you go, that could be a regular practice for me, or someone else's regular practice, I could do that once, and I think it would be fruitful. And so to share my own example, one thing I admire that my husband and I are not doing at the moment is that I have two friends who are housemates who have decided that, while they're living together, they will always live somewhere that has a spare room. And they want to do that because they want to always be able to host someone. And not just the way my husband and I host someone, because we live in Manhattan and we live in a studio apartment. And so people who stay with us stay essentially in our bedroom, which is our only room, on the floor on an air mattress, or the couch. If we're hosting a larger group of people, then they stay on both. But my friends have made the commitment that they always want to be able to host someone, not just for a night, but to host someone long term. If they're leaving somewhere where they're in danger, if they're having a really hard time economically, they want it just always to be plausible that someone can stay with Lindsay and Sarah. And that's not something my family's taking on this moment, but it wasn't something I'd actively said no to. It was something I hadn't considered until I saw them doing it. So the more we kind of speak up in praise of what we admire in others without automatically saying we're taking on that project ourselves, the more chances someone has, again, for the Holy Spirit to not work quite so hard, or at least to work through you, and give someone the chance to go, is that a good choice for my household? Rather than, it never occurred to me to. And just as one last story, the way that this really got started as a project for me, as an active project, again, not something I just happened to be doing or happened to not be doing, but was actively cultivating, was that I've just had really good luck on these, I swear. A very contentious Twitter thread turned into a dinner party because people were arguing about Rod Dreher's book and the idea of the Benedict option before the book had been published, which is a hard time frame to argue about a book. And Twitter is not a great medium in which to argue about a book that none of us has read. We've kind of read gesturings at it. So people were amenable ultimately to gathering at my house and kind of talking about community there. And I let everyone have all of dinner for the hypotheticals, and that's where we had kind of the commune plans, et cetera, the roving underground nursing service for when all Catholic nursing is outlawed, everyone could say whatever they wanted upstairs. And we were all allowed to go wherever with that conversation. Then okay, but for dessert, we're going to talk about the next 2 weeks to 2 months and things we might actually do now, and really framed our discussion about that. And that's when people started naming the things they wanted out of community, and usually things they hadn't named aloud to each other. That's when people said they wanted to be able to sing. That's when folks who didn't have children, weren't married or didn't have children yet, said they wanted to see children at all. Not across the street in someone else's stroller, but to have an ongoing relationship with other families and other children. And we did have folks who needed babysitting, so that was a good connection to make explicitly. That's when we heard people say that they wanted to go to adoration with other folks sometimes. And all of these were mostly very reasonable desires, very modest desires. They were not secret underground Catholic nursing service desires. But they were desires mostly people didn't bring up because they weren't sure if anyone could meet them. To bring it up to one individual would sound like a demand. And just simply the less and less people talk about perfectly reasonable desires for joy and worship like singing, the more it feels like you're strange for wanting to live a full human life, and not that our culture is narrow. And so we shared these stories of what we wanted. And I asked people also to talk about what they had to offer our group. So people had different things. Some people had flexible work schedules, which made an enormous difference for folks who were at home with kids. And again, kind of one of their wants was seeing someone who isn't two. Not seeing my 2-year-old, but seeing someone who isn't 2 more often than I do right now. So people with flexible work schedules who could just drop in on families was one of the things people had to offer. Only some of us had cars, which I think might be a different distribution in this room. Only some of us had driver's license, which I'm sure is a different distribution in this room. So it certainly felt like a more relevant thing to specifically say, I can offer. Some people had pianos or guitars and were willing to offer those. And then I had kind of a clever thing, so I was like going to do mine. And I'm like, well, those are all clearly useful things, but we also have some people who can offer constraints. Because Sarah, as we all know, because it's extremely visible, is pregnant, and soon she'll have a baby. And because she's already part of our friend group, we won't design all our events in a way that make it impossible for young parents to come. Because we already have young parents here who don't want to have events that go till 11 as the only kind of event we have. And so that's great, because Sarah's offering is that now we'll be a group that won't exclude young parents. And if she weren't here, we might accidentally grow into one of those. And I kind of was like, yes. It's a very profound thought, Leah. And then after I said it, there was kind of a moment of silence where I was feeling very good about myself. And then one person said, well, if that's one of the ways we're thinking about it, I'm an alcoholic. So if there's anyone here who needs to talk to someone who has problems with alcohol, I can be that person. And after she said that, someone else talked about being in recovery from anorexia. And someone else, more than one person, mentioned experiences with major depression. And I'd known some of these stories before that night, but not all of them. And no one was disclosing these things to a room of people who all already knew. And as I heard friend after friend, and sometimes Twitter person, who I did not know very well, take the crosses in their life and the thorns in their side and say, this is what I can offer the group. My suffering is what I can offer the group. That's why we know that our lives are sufficient to offer others. That God has given us everything we need to love others. And you don't have to have a tidy home or fancy china or skill at cooking to offer hospitality. Because when my friends thought about what it was that they had to build a community on, they named their griefs. Thank you. Yeah, Q&A.
Some time for questions, Q&A. Anyone has any comments, etc.?
So perhaps if I hired you as a consultant, a lot of what you talked about is beautiful, and you clearly have the gift of hospitality, and others do as well. But if you were going to get advice, counsel to a pastor who wants to foster this, would you see it best in the home context, or is there ways to do it in a larger parish-based, school-based context?
I'm just going to repeat the question in the gist of it, which is, how should a pastor or someone kind of managing large groups of folks think about whether hospitality should be built most through the parish or through individual projects and communities? And I think the obvious answer is it's both, right? But I think kind of my rule of thumb for thinking about which projects I pursue through my parish and which projects I pursue by myself is that as a layperson, I have the freedom to take on weirder projects or projects that are less likely to work than a parish is. And I think that's a real exciting freedom that every layperson in this room has. Parishes have to go through a lot of stuff. I don't work in a parish, a lot of paperwork just to reserve a room and then to figure out who will lock up after this and how many people will all be involved in making this happen and is it worth it? And will there be one person in the parish who had just a very bad experience with a similar program who will then call us, et cetera, et cetera. Which is a headache I don't have. And also with parishes, there's always the question of, are we making the promise to do this forever? And people find it more credible when they know I am not, right? So I think lay people have much more freedom to experiment with what kind of community they offer, to do something that's a good idea to do once and then to never ever do again if you don't want to after trying it. And a lot more freedom just to offer like more niche events that maybe a parish isn't going to put its name and weight behind. And that might just be like, this is a really fascinating book, but we don't really think everyone in the parish needs to read it. And we don't mean to say everyone in the parish should stop what they're doing and read Father Nowen's Return of the Prodigal Son, even though it's good. And so there's kind of a less pressure from a friend's recommendation. And then sometimes you can also just do things that like definitely the parish shouldn't do. My husband and I organized a like small Marian procession for the Feast of Mary, Mother of the Church, which happened for the first time last year, I think, ever. 2 years ago? Last year. Yes, last year. And so for the first time for me as a convert, I'm celebrating a feast for the first time, but also all of you are. So we gathered folks together and we just like printed out our favorite art of Mary, put it on like little things around our necks, and then like walked outside and prayed the rosary. And we were in New York, so again, like, this was not that weird. You guys have had processions, so I know it's only like so weird here anyway. But we did not have a permit, and there were 10 of us. So it's easier for us to just do a small thing casually. Versus when my parish has processions, and they do, and I love them, we have the New York Police Department out on little mopeds escorting us. So there's a bigger lift to do something, even if it's a good idea, than just a small good idea where if it blows up, the parish is not in trouble. So that is our charism lay people. Weirder, interesting ideas with more freedom to fail.
I guess I'm wondering how you see this progressing. Is this something, this group of friends that you're talking about, is this something that you expect to have some kind of permanence to it? Or is it just kind of an ad hoc thing that people will drink in and out of? To give you a little background, I belong to one of the intentional communities that came out of the charismatic years ago. And that intentionality of we are in this together come what may is an important thing in building community. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so the question is, how much is this a short-term project versus a long-term project with long-term commitments? And for the most part, I think that the most long-term feature of it is building up these habits for the long term, and this receptivity to hospitality, but not necessarily to the specific group of people. And that's very specific to where I am in life, where I'm living, as I said, in a studio apartment, where I do not and cannot expect to live if God graces us with a child. We hope very much to have to move out of the studio apartment. But in that meantime, we don't want to live in a temporary way. We want to live the way we intend to live our whole lives, making large commitments, and knowing we won't make kind of promises of stability that we know are unkeepable, but not to kind of have only half friendships because we won't keep them up over the long term. One thing I find really encouraging is just like a lot of very close and deep friendships in history were epistolary. And I don't think it's automatically a problem if I love people deeply now and don't get to live near them forever, though I visit them more. I do want to ultimately try and get to live where my godson lives, and we hope that will work out between our two families. But I think my suspicion is that people should embrace more good short-term ideas to cultivate the habit for when they can make long-term promises. And because our culture encourages people to wait till marriage for deep friendships, and wait till mortgage for deep friendships. And neither of those are livable. I hope to make even deeper commitments later, but I want to make the ones I can now. But my actual program involves kind of no intentional community or lay apostolate. It's just friendship in a culture that keeps forgetting to do it. Actually, I'll go over here first. Yeah, I'm ignoring you, Brian. Go ahead.
I'm wondering about the community friends that you invite in, and how do you welcome the unlovable or the annoying person
This is a great question of how do you welcome people you do not want to welcome into your house? I'm going to give 3 short examples, none of which have names attached because you guys have a camera right here. I sometimes issued kind of open invitations on Facebook where everyone who's friends with me can see them, and had people come who I did not know, though I get like a little warning that they RSVP'd. And in some cases that they were, one person was kind of physically off-putting, and I don't know what his situation was, but like didn't behave as I expected him to behave in my house. Not doing anything bad, just enough that I felt like I had less confidence about how he would behave for the whole event. And in that case, we both found him kind of like unsettling, me and my husband, but never that he did something that was actually a problem. And most of what we did to kind of handle that was we didn't deliberately invite him to things, but when he saw the invitations that were available to him, he came over. And my husband sat next to him just because we thought it would be more tense for a woman to sit next to a man who was behaving in slightly erratic ways. So Alexi kind of took responsibility to make sure everyone in the place felt welcomed by solving the problem of the seat people might not want to sit in, which I really appreciated that he did. Another problem we have is I have a friend who I don't like, and this example I can say like, oh, there's a person who had kind of erratic behavior, so we never knew what it could escalate into. This person is fine, I just don't like her. And I've prayed to like her more, and I haven't done really well at it. And I just like suffer, and then sometimes I complain to my husband, including like, obviously there's nothing wrong with name, like, but I don't like her in my house, and I just suck it up. And pray, like. And then the third example is kind of my most serious example, which is I had a friend reach out to me in DC and tell me that she wasn't going to RSVP to my events on Facebook, which is something I asked people to do so I could purchase food accordingly. And I usually hassled people about doing so that I could purchase food proportionately. And she wasn't going to do it because there was a guy coming to my events who seemed to be paying attention to whether she was coming. And she planned to only come to ones he wasn't coming to. So she was going to watch the event RSVPs and only come if he wasn't coming, because he made her pretty uncomfortable. And I didn't know who it was. And I asked her if she'd be comfortable telling me who this guy was, and she wasn't. She said she didn't want to cause a problem or like start something, as a 3-way problem between all of us. She was going to handle this by never being at my house if he was there. And this wasn't a really satisfactory conclusion for me. Obviously, I gave her permission to RSVP to me privately by email. And one of the reasons it was kind of most worrying is I could think of more than one person who it was possible it was. And I don't think it's funny either, actually. There had been people who had made me uncomfortable in my house without necessarily trying to behave inappropriately towards me. One of the most straightforward cases was a person who worked in a wine shop, brought wine to my events. Fine, I didn't ask him to, but that's fine. Offered it to me. I don't like wine. Like, I just don't like it, and I'm particularly loath to have it from someone who specializes in it and then like might lecture me on not liking it. So I said like, oh, thanks so much for bringing it. Like, please offer it to anyone who wants. I'm not going to have any, but go for it. And he's like, oh, but you'll really like this one. I'm like, no, thank you. Like, don't waste any on me. I've never liked a wine I've tried, so I don't want you to pour me a glass. And he's like, I'll pour you one. And I'm like, don't do that, please. And it's that kind of, it's a version of what made me uncomfortable with the person who just like, was disheveled and seemed erratic, but like a more specific one of a man who is not listening to a woman tell him no. And doesn't seem to care. And you just don't know. And I don't know whether he was socially awkward or just really excited about wine, or someone who doesn't care when a woman says no to him. So I don't want to make a specific claim about his character, but I had to be more careful around him after having kind of that evidence that I should. And so one of the things I changed was not just that this girl could RSVP privately to me. I thought a little differently about how I hosted events. Usually I tried to, like, once the event was over, kick everyone out, because I did not want people to stay in my house indefinitely once I was done. And like I didn't even want them to do the thing that's like nice sometimes, where like, oh, let me help you wash up, and I'm like, no, like please leave. I'm done hosting. And also, you don't all of you wash up to like the exact standards I want or put things in the wrong place. I just want to wash up on myself. Please go home, right? But I realized that when I was kicking everyone out, I didn't give folks, especially again women, the flexibility to make sure they didn't leave at the same time as someone they didn't want to leave with. So after this one girl had reached out to me, I started kind of saying, all right, everyone should leave, but instead of really like urging people to go out in the first wave, if someone was hanging back, I did not hassle them. I assumed it was possible they had a reason for hanging back. And then if they didn't, they're like, oh yeah, let's hang out and chat. And I'm like, nope, you're out. And I really want to mention this because I think it's something that women do think about a lot more by necessity than men, about how to have a clear exit from a situation that isn't comfortable. And that's all the more important when it's in your house. So I think being attentive to those kind of casual interactions where someone's making someone uncomfortable and may not be aware they're doing it. So it may be a chance for fraternal correction, again, especially from a friend who sees this, and especially from a male friend who sees this, would be a chance for my wine person to just really improve his behavior. But it wasn't something where I was going to escalate it by correcting him there. So.
I'll take the last question.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So, I don't want to create a dichotomy between your book, Lumen Veritatis, and Rod Dreher's. But one of the things that we talked about is inviting people who may not at all share in your value system, your faith, your ideology, in the best sense of the word, and the tension that might cause versus, and not to pigeonhole Rod Dreher, but to say, the goal is to gather with like-minded people and build up these small communities for the zombie apocalypse. How do you live in that?
Well, here's what I'll say to the question of how do you balance being together and really strengthening our faith with people who share it, and broader hospitality, which may include inviting people who don't share our faith at all or are hostile to it. And my answer is the very Catholic answer of both and, right? But to do both deliberately and not ask events to always achieve both at the same time. And again, this is another layperson, not parish strength. That sometimes I just throw events where I don't restrict who can come at all. I'm just pretty confident my Protestant friends don't want to come to a Marian procession where we all hang images of Mary around our neck and pray the rosary. And if they want to, mazel tov, right? But they don't. Sometimes I have events where I think it's going to attract a narrower audience than it does. So when we moved into our studio, we asked our priest, Father Innocent, OP, to come over and do a house blessing for us, which is still licit even if the house has only one room, apparently. I was like, is it a house blessing? But it is. And so we told folks, we're going to make cookies and have our house blessed. There's going to be a priest in a full habit, and he told us that the amount of incense he's bringing is turn off your smoke detector. This is how we discovered our apartment doesn't have one, which is... And so I honestly thought that was going to attract mostly Catholic friends. But whether it's just the fact that it sounds like housewarming, even though it's house blessing, or that there were cookies, half of everyone who came was not Catholic. And a third was atheist. And that was fine because we were able to do the house blessing. People didn't join in on amens if it wouldn't be true to say amen. And then afterwards, we ate cookies, and people had a lot of questions for Father Innocent, and I think it was a nice kind of moment of evangelization and witness, especially because our friends didn't feel pressured. They weren't being asked to pretend to be Catholic to be there, but they got to see it and interact to the extent they felt comfortable. Sometimes I've said, more clearly, this is a Christian-focused event, and mostly that's worked all right because the event has been off-putting to people who aren't. Sometimes I've had friends go but why can't I be there? I'm like, because this is a space where we're talking about this from a specifically Christian lens. And if we wanted to have a broader conversation, we would, but that's not what we're doing this time. And in my case, I'm and I have a lot of other things at my house that you're very welcome to, but this is very specific and narrow, this conversation. And sometimes I just have events that don't have specific Christian overtones, except insofar as they're in my house, which there's only one room. So like all the icons are visible. Like the very large crucifix we were given at our wedding is visible. Like no one is unaware they're in a Catholic house, even if they're there for a secular gathering. But it's really up to them whether they want to ask questions or have any issues with that. And sometimes we've kind of added a Catholic element to a secular gathering, but then we give people a heads up ahead of time so that they have a little more flexibility. So when we did the chalking of the doors for our 12th night reading, we told everyone, get here at this time if you want to be here for chalking of the doors. Here's what it is. Get here at this time if you just want Shakespeare. Either is fine. And there we had like a mixed group for chalking because people were curious. When we had an all-day Shakespeare marathon of watching The Hollow Crown Part 2, which is Henry VI Part 1, 2, 3, and then Richard III, and it's really good. So it was like a big day, and we're like, show up at 11 a.m. for pancakes, show up at 10:30 for morning office. And no one showed up for morning office. And we had Catholics who were coming, they just didn't want to get up, right? So my husband and I did morning office. And that's a change I made because sometimes when I offer, does anyone want to stay and do night prayer? My non-Christian friends did feel like they were getting kicked out and the Christians were getting to stay. So I've done more of doing things at the beginning of events when I've had the mix so people don't feel as bad about being late, which is wrong. Everyone should feel bad about being late. That's why I explicitly say there are 2 start times. But I think ultimately, I don't think anything I've said is actually in substantial disagreement with what Rod is doing. And I think I'm right because he wrote the foreword to the book, so he's read it. But I think like the actual project that strengthens us for a hostile world is gathering together in joy to renew our faith with others. And that the more we do that and we don't only think of our faith through the lens that it attracts negative attention, which can be easy to do if that's the main time you have conversations about your faith, is with like your aunt or your niece or your brother-in-law who hates Catholicism, and that's your main experience of thinking about the church with others. That's quite hard. But if you're gathering together for hymns or poems or good reading with others, you have a lot more that's part of how you share the faith with others already. And it may make it easier to have those hard conversations, to have this well of good experiences and love to draw on, or it may just be hard the whole time and you have to pray a whole lot, so no guarantees.